South Africa will make history as the first African country to preside over the G20, with approximately 130 meetings planned for the year 2025. As the only African nation in the G20, South Africa's presidency will present an opportunity to focus on African priorities and properties such as economic development, climate change, health, and digital transformation. It's worth noting that the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa stated that his country will put the African continent first as the country assumes the presidency as of December 1, 2024. The South African leadership made public that his country had adopted a G20 presidency theme of solidarity, equality, and sustainability, and he added that through this presidency they seek to strengthen solidarity, whether it in the Gaza, Sudan, or Ukraine, and stand with solidarity with all the people who are facing hardship as well as suffering. He said it is a step to firmly place the development priorities of the African continent and the global south on the G20 agenda, with focus on inclusive economic growth, industrialization, employment, inequality, and food security. He expressed his support for nations who are vulnerable to pandemics, most especially within the continent of Africa, and as well highlighting that many countries in the continent are currently facing mpox outbreaks that require urgent international action. He stated that the country plans to make this event a civil society-driven event, telling G20 leaders that it is a bridge between them and those whose lives are impacted by their decisions. The G20 bloc consists of 19 countries, the European Commission, and the African Union. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall be unpacking this recent statement by the South African president, whereas the nation prepares to assume the presidency of the G20 bloc of influential countries. It says it plans to put the Africa first. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Talking Point. Stay with us. As we saw during the BRICS in 2023, South Africa is making history once again, as it would be the first African country to assume the G20 presidency come December 1, 2024 for a duration of 1 year. And of course, according to the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, he says that his country is very committed to preserving, or better still, defending the interests of the African continent during its 1-year tenure. And of course, to evoke this topic of discussion this day, I'm first of all being joined all the way from Kenya by our guest for today, Boniface Harrison, who is the Executive Director of MUEMACTION Post, joining us all the way from Kenya. Thank you immensely, sir, for joining us.
You're welcome, and thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you once again, and we're equally I've been joined by Dr. Stanley FONGOD, PAN-AFRICANIST, economist, and the CEO of Croston FinTech. It's a pleasure to have you in today's edition of the program.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me, and thank our viewers for joining in as well, and thank my co-panelists for joining in also.
To debut today's conversation, which focuses on the interests of the African continent within the G20 bloc, is worth noting that on numerous occasions, Africa has actually tried to voice its concerns on the global stage. And of course, this G20 presidency, an opportunity being presented to South Africa, is a historic one, not just for the African nation, but for the African continent. And to debut this conversation this day with you, Harrison, what's your appraisal of the just ended G20 summit that took place in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil?
Sorry, I didn't get the question right.
So as I was saying that what's your appraisal of the just ended G20 summit that took place in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where we saw the baton of command being handed over to South Africa?
Yeah, thank you. This is historic to have an African country now leading one of the most powerful blocs across the world. I think this is just transformative, and it's time to show for an African country and an African to show what they can do for their people, given such a powerful position. Because Africa, as much as we may not want to lean too much on the challenges that Africa has been facing, Africa has really been facing challenges. from poverty, disease, and even illiteracy levels. So this gathering was extraordinary, and we are looking forward to having extraordinary progress going forward because this is a new moment.
It's a new moment indeed for the African continent. Over to you, Dr. FONGOD. Now, given from a Pan-African perspective, how did you welcome this recent move, given that South Africa next year, 2025, will assume the presidency as of December 1st, 2024, of the G20 bloc of influential powers come this year?
Well, I'm thinking that if we were going to start probably having more of a forecast as to what South Africa will do, we need to also try as much as we can to look backwards, more like in financial terms, looking at the balance sheet, trying to figure out what will have been the gains that the G20 summit will have achieved so far as the African or other countries are concerned. I'm looking at, you just asked a question about the appraisal for the last G20 summit. I'm looking at the last G20 summit. I'm telling myself one of the most notable things that was said during the G20 summit was the Global Alliance Against, I think it was called Hunger and Poverty or something like that, with about 82 countries, endorsed by 82 countries. The reality about about food scarcity and about elevating poverty around the world it's welcome news, and I think that is something that everyone should celebrate. But when it comes to the African, the issue is not that we are trying to be able to be taken out of poverty or hunger. And I think that that is where most of those in the global stage missed out so far as Africa is concerned. The idea about alleviating hunger on the African continent is not sending container loads of goods, container loads of milk, cheese, and God knows what, to the continent of Africa, because Africa has become more of an orphanage where the West can just, give us what we're looking for because we are dying of hunger. I get that point, but the reality is what we need so far as the continent is concerned is for us to be able to improve the notion of the issues that we have, especially if you're talking about, which is one of the agendas, trying to take care of hunger. We need to be able to become self-sustaining. That means we need to be able to invest in the areas of agriculture. We need to be able to do in agricultural research. We have to be able to find ways in which we get into mechanized farming and move away from subsistence farming. We have to make sure that we are able to farm enough, not just to feed ourselves, but also to export what we farm, and also export within Africa what we are farming across different sectors of the continent. I was mentioning not long ago about how Nigeria produces probably out of all the fruits that Nigeria produces per annum, all she actually consumes is around maybe between 15 to 20%. But the rest of the 80% of whatever she produces in terms of fruits basically gets destroyed. Not just that, we can't even be able to convert that, all right? We can't even convert what Nigeria produces into some semi-finished or finished products that we can actually keep, like converting fruits into fruit juice concentrate. We basically just allow it to get rotten. Meanwhile, countries like Sudan, countries in the Sahel, most of those northern countries, even those in Ethiopia, they are importing to the tunes of millions of just fruits coming in out of Europe. So we have to find that balance that is more meaningful to the African. These meetings, I don't know exactly how many of them we have now, the G20, God knows what else we do have out there. We have these talks. They sound good, but in context to the African, we need to have more structure that actually help us on the continent of Africa than these fanciful ideas coming from those in the intelligentsia, those coming from the academic community. I'm talking about folks who are actually doing things on the ground which is meaningful, not just something that looks good on an academic paper.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fongod. Now, amongst things which the South African country is going to look at during its presidency was in tenure during the within the G20 bloc is going to focus on things like economic development, food security, digital transformation, health, like I earlier mentioned, climate change, and others. Now, but before diving into detail into trying to understand these various aspects in the context of the African continent, Harrison, how do you think South Africa can take advantage of this opportunity given to the African nation to voice out some of the key concerns of the African continent?
Yeah, given that now South Africa has an opportunity and such a privilege to lead one of the most powerful blocs, I think, in my observation, South Africa has produced some of the greatest Pan-Africanists, like Nelson Mandela, like this other young guy who was vying for president recently. What is his name? I'm forgetting. Very great people who believe in Malema, Julius Malema. A very great visionary people who believe in the ideals of Africa. But I'm not quite sure whether South Africa has positioned herself as a voice for Africa. Because I think, in my observation, Kenya has established herself more at the global stage than South Africa. And this is not to draw a comparison or supremacy issues, but it takes some level of passion and a level of dedication to champion for the African interest because, again, South Africa being a very developed country, unlike most of the African countries, a question would arise as to whether South Africa really understands the challenges that face Africa. So that is a challenge because it is not a situation that SA can't, but it is a challenge that they should demonstrate empathy and understanding of the collective African challenges that we face. So, for example, in climate change, we are talking about climate finance, and climate finance has been one of the most hardly debated topics because this finance is always promised and never given.
Exactly.
So this is also the chance to actually get finances for loss and damage in Africa, so that vulnerable communities, those who have been affected by climate change, can actually gain real benefits. As my co-panelists said, these meetings sometimes have, and these platforms are very good with diplomatic language and deliberations and charters and everything. But sometimes the impact of these gatherings is not felt by the ordinary people. One of the biggest challenges in Africa is unemployment, for example. We have seen Africans being ferried or taking themselves to foreign countries like in the Middle East. Others are in Europe, others are in America. And that is because opportunities are very limited in Africa. And that is not because we cannot have these opportunities. It's because our opportunities, our resources have been underutilized for interest. So this is also the chance for South Africa to showcase that, because the reason why South Africa has this power to transform a lot of things in Africa. For example, they are the people who will be setting the agenda of key things, of key issues to be discussed. world organizations like the IMF, World Trade Organization, World Bank are all part of G20. So it means, and these are the organizations that fund a lot of development in Africa. So to be very specific about unemployment, we need a time when we will have development that will spur employment in our continent. Could it be in agriculture? Could it be in manufacturing? Could it be in even informal work where people are doing what we call artisan work? We need more production from Africa, because now it is time for an African to speak for fellow Africans. Because I think in the equation of that regional organization is Africa deserves more from that table. And that is not to create an entitlement, but it is just to show the urgency of need for more support to be given to Africa. So those two key issues, for example, climate and unemployment, are key things that we look forward to South Africa putting forward and creating real solutions that will create opportunities here at home. Because we don't want our people to be known for casual work abroad, and they're desperate. They end up getting culture shocks, they end up getting deported, working conditions are bad, they can't see their families. So it is important. Those two key areas would be my priority areas for this point. So I know there are more issues that need to be addressed, but for now, I can mention climate and unemployment.
And of course, it's worth noting that the issue even of unemployment is something that is very pertinent on the African continent, including this issue of climate finance. And you noted beautifully well that we have countries like Kenya that could relate, because it's mostly seen in the eastern part of the African continent, where we have seen countries within this sub-region are being affected. We do not want to cite the food security crisis ongoing in other parts of the African continent, especially in the Horn of Africa, like cited Dr. FONGOD. Now, with you, Dr. FONGOD, now proceeding, earlier on cited that we're going to move step by step in trying to unpack some of these issues that the South African president cited the nation was going to address during their tenure. And now, with a special focus on security, when we look at countries like Sudan, you look at countries like the Horn of Africa that has witnessed security turbulences in recent years. You equally look at a nation like the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Sahel region. How do you think, with this recent call by Africa getting a permanent seat within the United Nations Security Council in a bid to have a say in issues of its own interests, how do you think South Africa can position itself in championing for some of these issues that the African continent have long been vying for, like getting a permanent seat, or better still addressing its internal security crisis?
I think we know exactly what's wrong with the continent.
Exactly.
And the idea that we have to push as much as we can for the international community to fully understand the issues we are facing on the continent, which in most part has been caused by them. That in itself, I think South Africa stands in a better position to become the spokesperson for the continent of Africa. I think that we now have a united front, which would be South Africa to speak up so far as the issues pertaining to the Africa is concerned, especially if you look at places like the DRC, if you look at places like the Sahel. We are talking about issues of security in places like Sudan. We fully understand what is going on. What is fascinating is that if you look at the G20, each and every one of those nations has something to do so far as the continent of Africa is concerned, and has a lot to do so far as the insecurity that we are facing in Africa is concerned. On the energy sector, for example, and also when we talk about energy sectors and the mineral sector, you're looking at the mining sector, you're looking at countries that are literally making tremendous amount of money from what is it that is being mined out of the country continent of Africa, you're looking at countries like Japan. And what you're looking at is a country that is, basically doing a lot in the microchip technology. And most of those microchip technology, what is being used in those microchips technology comes from the continent of Africa. We have to start addressing the issues that we are facing directly to the nations that are benefiting from what is happening on the continent. And so if you want to talk about this, the issues of insecurity in the Sahel, you must be able to start having deep conversations with the United States of America as a result of what happened to Gaddafi, which precipitated the issues that we are having out there now. There was no, almost certainly we were, the continent, the Sahel was a very peaceful place before the guy called Barack Hussein Obama came along. And as a result of that, the Sahel has disintegrated because Libya disintegrated also. We have to be able to find this a united front in being able to table the issues that we are facing, either be it at the level of the United Nations or be it at the level of the G20 summit. I understand that the G20 summit is initial concept. It is a concept had to do with the Asian Pacific crisis, the financial problem that happened in Asia. I think this was back in 1997. I understand its concept had to do with money. They had to be able to find ways in which they can have a policy that was united across many fronts. But then they now expanded, so that they could get developing nations involved in that. And their mandate, actually, in terms of its creation, had nothing to do with security. I get that, but we cannot longer go along with that premise, knowing mindfully well that the simple reason why the continent of Africa is in the quagmire that she's in is because of the many countries that are coming in to harvest, to rape the continent, of all her natural resources. And in the wake of all of that madness, we have many militia groups, like in places like the DRC, that is doing their beating for them, and also in the Sahel, that is doing their beatings for them. So we basically have to be able to find ways in which we have those deep conversations. The Arab League, led by, in my opinion, Saudi Arabia, needs to be able to have a concerted effort, a real legitimate talk when it comes to what's happening in the Sahel, what's happening even with Al-Shabaab out in the east of Africa, in that Horn of Africa. We need to be able to have deep conversations with countries like Saudi Arabia, because if you have elements in these countries from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and all those Arab nations that are sponsoring terrorist activities in the Sahel, sponsoring groups like Al-Shabaab, sponsoring groups like you have ISIS, or maybe you have the Al-Qaeda of the Greater Sahara. If you have those groups that has been sponsored from deep within Saudi Arabia, then it's against every single thing that they stand for. So we have to be able to basically, I think South Africa needs to be talking to Saudi Arabia and actually letting Saudi Arabia to fully understand exactly that such things should not be happening on the African continent, and there has to be deep talks of basically persecuting folks who are sponsoring terrorist activities on the continent of Africa. Secondly, I think we need to start talking to countries like Brazil. I understand the whole entire, Brazil is a very huge market so far as agriculture is concerned. I get that. But I also understand that we have to find ways in which, when we start talking about climate change and how we address that on the continent of Africa, I am not a denier of climate change. And I think that when most people get to hear me talk, they feel I'm a denier of climate change. No, I'm not a denier of climate change. Once upon a time, the Sahara used to be savanna. The whole entire Sahara used to be savanna, teeming with wildlife. Luscious wildlife, just pristine African wildlife, all right? That used to be the whole of Sahara. But Sahara today is a complete desert, and there's nothing we have done in the 21st century or in the 20th century that converted the Sahara into a desert. And that's my point. What I'm trying to say is this, that we understand that the climate is changing, and how we go about solving climate change, it's something else that has to legitimately bridge two things. While we're looking at the scientific evidence in in being able to understand what is pushing and causing the climate to change, we must also understand the economic toll that we are putting, especially on developing nations, you know, and like the continent of Africa, where we have to find ways within all the academic documents and academic papers that we are writing to make sure that we include in for the African, all right, that provision that allow us also to escape poverty by basically being industrialized. We have to find ways to move from this primary levels of production in which we are in, and then go more into secondary levels of production. We really has to be able to do that. There has to be some form of industrialization on the African continent. And so far as I'm concerned, if we are able to just be able to adjust quarter by quarter, block by block, and initiative by initiative, getting all of these G20 members who are well to do, Brazil, India, Russia, you're looking at Saudi Arabia, Japan, the United States, we can just bring them together, and then to be able to force them, push their hand, bend their hand, you know, however we do it, so that they can now begin to be able to implement the issues, to correct the issues that we are facing on the African continent. And most of these issues are happening right in their backyard, and they are fully responsible for it. I think that will be meaningful.
It will be meaningful indeed, and of course it's Africa's role to take things into its own hands and of course transform the African continent despite the numerous challenges which it's facing. And now over to you, Harrison. Your co-panelists stated a lot of points, including the issue of climate change, which you earlier on mentioned. And moving forward with this issue of food security, earlier on Dr. Fongod was citing that it's imperative for Africans to be able to work amongst themselves from country to country, for them to be able to see how they can address some of issues like food security, where we have countries that have in abundance, especially food, and we have others that are literally reeling from the issue of food security and might at some point need humanitarian aid, citing nations like Sudan. Now, when you look at the countries within the African continent, looking at this issue of food security, according to the United Nations, as quoted by the South African president, nearly 700 million people are living in poverty. And of course, we have about 67% that were within sub-Saharan Africa. When you look at the statistics, we're looking at intra-trade that have been some sort of a tool which have been called by numerous pundits on the African continent to be strengthened so as to help counter this issue of food security within the continent of Africa. Inasmuch as there's food humanitarian aid coming into the continent, how do you believe that this issue of food security and food scarcity can be thoroughly addressed on the continent?
Yeah, indeed, the change of climate has resulted to food insecurity, and also factors such as technology have also made it difficult for Africa to be able to feed herself, because the solution for the food insecurity in Africa is when Africa can feed itself, when we can be able to grow. So sometimes I look at the kind of imports that we do, like in Kenya, we are importing maize, sometimes we import sugar, and I get to ask myself, is it that we cannot grow enough maize in Kenya? So, for example, these are things we can do, and one of the biggest challenges that has been happening, because also our internal processes like corruption, we have seen plantations that have been set aside to enhance food production, for example, and in my country being mismanaged and not actually working. So I think, firstly, for the South African president, he will need to have a discussion with fellow heads of states to ensure that we have programs that actually work without corruption. Because as an elder, now being the chair of G20, I hope they listen to him, because many times programs and the resources are set aside to enhance food production is a lot of times, many Africans have abandoned the organic and indigenous crops. And we have not been able to move past the foods we used to grow when the climate had not changed. For example, in my local area in Kenya, rains used to be very much in the past years, and we could grow maize, yeah, and it does well. But these days, maize doesn't do very well. And you find that farmers are still attached to growing maize, which means 2 months of rain when get a month of rain, end up not having enough food to sustain ourselves. Capacity building of farmers to ensure that they adopt climate smart agricultural products, practices. Because we need to, a lot of times, the climate will change, whether we like it or not. And our work should not be to stop climate from changing. Our work should be also to adapt to the changes that are happening in our ecosystem. So we need more resources to ensure that farmers are equipped with the right capacity to grow favorable crops in the African continent. Also, we have seen, and this is where South Africa should protect fellow Africans, because we have seen very controversial suggestions to combat food insecurity in Africa, like the genetically modified products, GMOs. While GMOs might be scientifically acceptable, we have solutions locally that we can explore to ensure that we sustain ourselves in an organic way. For example, you find places where people do no longer rely on animals to have meat. I don't think we are there yet as Africans. So if South Africa is going to lobby for resources to combat food insecurity in Africa, let us not have solutions that are not local. Yeah, we need South Africa to lobby on our behalf to enhance what we have, because that is what works for us. We have seen the negative effects of chemically manufactured foods because of the effects like cancer, high blood pressure, even sometimes deaths. So we need safe and secure solutions to food insecurity. I think also because we have a lot of arable land in Africa. When you go to Tanzania, you find a lot of arable land. You go to Zambia, the same. And I know most African countries are like that. But we don't, one of the challenges that we also face is water scarcity. And those are the effects of climate change. And it is very possible. We have seen countries like Israel transforming a desert area into a very productive land. So we need resources to ensure that we can transform and utilize our land into productivity. And we do not want things for free. I think we should not be given things for free. If it is investment, we can have investments that are both creating employment for ourselves and also creating food for people. So if we can get, like we have organizations like the IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization, the UN, G20, if we can have these resources come as projects or programs that are made to also enhance sustainability of the product, that will be transformative. So let us have more resources being channeled, and most importantly, we need to keep changing the mindset of also the young population in Africa. And we also need more resources for awareness creation and capacity building to ensure that young people, I know, for example, with the emergence of agripreneurship, where people are growing crops and vegetables for business and through very innovative ways. that has been attractive to the young people, because at some point, our young population in Africa had abandoned farming and made it look like it's a dirty affair, and it should be left for the people who are living in the villages. Exactly. But day by day, we are getting to understand that agriculture is something that everyone, people of all ages, can actually practice. So I think most of the key things in a nutshell is, one, President Cyril has to speak to fellow presidents to ensure that the money they allocate is properly utilized, because it is not as if we don't have programs that are meant to enhance food security. So speak to fellow presidents, Mr. President, to ensure that these monies are used properly. Secondly, let us get more funding in terms of projects to enhance innovation, such as digging water boreholes, enhancing irrigation, and also we need resources to capacity build our farmers so that they can adopt sustainable and locally fit agricultural products that will enhance food production in Africa. We have the capacity to so sometimes I pass by a place where there are rivers, and all you can see is children swimming, women washing their clothes, men fishing. You can go for almost a kilometer. You can't find a farm that is alongside a river. Why? Because this population may not have the money to acquire resources like pumps to pump water. Yeah, sometimes they don't have the knowledge to know that instead of always relying on buying crops and looking for employment, you can utilize what you have to ensure that we have more food production. So those would be my views on food production. We need more action. And at this point, if President Cyril will succeed in stirring Africa and gearing Africa towards more activity that is supported, that will make it food secure, such that Africa can feed herself, President Cyril will be one of the most successful people in the world, because that is a problem that has faced Africans for a very long time.
I'll be staying with you, Harrison. You've cited a lot of very powerful points, which I would like to capitalize on, including the issue of change of mindset on the African continent. You said that it's imperative for the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa, to collaborate with his counterparts on the African continent for them to be able to address this issue of food insecurity. But away from that, we have numerous countries, like a co-panelist was stating, we still have countries on the continent like Egypt, like Ethiopia, that are exporting the agricultural produce to foreign markets. You cited Tanzania. Tanzania does have arable land, but the country is equally producing, and it's often said that agriculture is the backbone of every society. With this said, do you believe that Africa is indeed ready? Because if we are looking at a change of mindsets, and we have South Africa who will be assuming the presidency of the G20, do you think Africa is actually ready for this change that is actually coming? If, say, the South African president, say he meets up with this African counterparts and they get to exchange, but you believe that really, what of the discourse will be fully implemented for the benefit of the African continent?
Yes, I know change might be a bit difficult because, for example, in Kenya, we export tea, we export avocados, but that's not enough. We import a lot more.
Exactly.
And for example, tea is planted in a very small percentage of our land. So it means the other whole left piece of the country rarely exports a lot of things. So in terms of what we export, we are not doing very well as Africans. And the fact that we reach a point where we can import maize, which is like the staple food in Kenya, it means really we are reeling in problems. So Africa needs to actually be ready. And I believe that readiness is kick-started by a leader. And right now, President Cyril is the leader. And I believe he can be able to transform and inspire fellow African presidents into taking more action about creating structures and programs that will enhance food security in their country. Because we are exporting, but we are getting very little in return sometimes. Farmers are not well compensated. Our products, we do not yet process our products. We export everything raw. We need, because if we have more processing plants where we can have an end product, and this is maybe to carry on from the discussion we were having the other day about being able to produce end products. It is not good that tea is being plucked from Kenya and it has to be taken to another country so that it can become an end product. We are denying ourselves a lot of benefits, like employment, like the repurposing of the waste that is gotten from the products that we have processed. So we need more investment. Really, we need it, because if Africa is not going truly, if a person has their stomach empty, they can be controlled by anyone. And our independence as Africans and our autonomy as Africans is really going to be determined by how full our stomachs are. If someone else is, and you mentioned the very key element of aid, if we depend on aid, he who pays the piper, he who pays the what? That's saying, that is what is going to happen. We're going to lose our autonomy, we're going to lose our power, because someone else is feeding us. Yeah, and they're feeding us with their taxpayers' money. For example, my understanding of US aid is that it is Americans who are sharing their resources with Africans. We need to move away from there. We need to be able to feed ourselves so that we can speak at the table. You can't even have moral authority to speak to anyone who has fed you. You can't speak to anyone who has helped you process everything from scratch. The only thing you know is to plant and harvest. You don't know how to process it. And sometimes we even in the local African markets, we are left with the low quality products, and the most quality products are taken abroad so that they can be taken by people who can pay more. Then we are left with very low quality products. I think that needs to change. And the reason why we have leaders as presidents in our countries is so that they can transform and offer solutions to the challenges that we are facing. So this is the time. Actually, time has been since way back. But every day we believe that someone will take action and lead change. And my submission is that President Cyril needs to inspire. We saw another meeting that was happening in Senegal recently, where people were talking about, the president was talking about feeding ourselves. But sometimes these discussions are just left in these conferences. We need real actions about food security. And as I said before, with resources, with the right mindsets, and without corruption, we can go far. These are things that if you come up, I've seen locally, the communities in Africa are very well receptive of programs that are going to feed them. If you are genuinely determined to hold their hand and let them manage their own affairs. I've seen very young change makers training local communities how to design kitchen gardens, how to make their homes self-sufficient in terms of food. And communities are very receptive of those ideas. It means that these are people who can take up solutions and run with them as long as they are supported and facilitated. The only challenge that we get in Africa is when we don't have leaders who are consistent, leaders who are genuinely passionate about sometimes transforming the lives of fellow Africans. So in terms of readiness for change, this is the time. We are actually late. let us bring all hands on deck and let us act towards food security in Africa, led by President Cyril and the African Union leadership, which again, African Union is part of the G20. And we also have our own reservations with African Union because the impact is hardly felt on the ground. We don't see what they're doing. But let us give a chance to President Cyril to see what he can do, the impact that he can cause amongst fellow presidents. And if we have seen before, from the ages of Kwame Nkrumah, from the ages of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, there are many Africans who have had great visions for this continent, but sometimes they ended up being disappointed. Let us give it another chance and hope that this time we're going to have change. We shouldn't be comfortable at all importing most of the things that we feed on. That is not good at all. We have the capacity to feed ourselves, and we can achieve it if we are well supported. So I believe this is the way to go, and it's time.
It is time indeed, and of course action is in the hands of Africans. Action as begins with you and I. And now moving forward to you, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, you are into fintech, and this time around we'll be diving into digital transformation as well as health on the African continent. You listen carefully to your co-panelists, and in line with what the South African president said, the Chinese will focus on health, and most especially the outbreak of mpox on the African continent. When you look at the health situation of Africa, simultaneously, when you equally look at the growing digital transformation that's happening in the African continent, we could cite nations like Kenya, we could cite nations like Rwanda that are gradually becoming technical hubs on the African continent in terms of digital technology. Now, how important will it be for Africa to be able to maximize this growing evolution within the context of the African continent to address issues of health, like is the case of the mpox, which on numerous occasions African countries have decried the fact that at a global level Africa is somewhat marginalized and is not given the equal position which it deserves. Now, how can Africa maximize some of these potentials to counter some of these issues that are affecting the African continent?
Well, I don't really think that Africa has been marginalized by anyone because obviously those who are in power on the African continent have their annual physical and their annual examination outside of the continent of Africa. Exactly. So there has not been a time when anyone who is leading us on the continent of Africa went to any of our local hospitals and then suddenly realized that they could not get the kind of healthcare that they needed. So the issues that we are facing on the continent of Africa is unique, but we have to find ways in which we start dealing with these issues ourselves. How can we be able to help the continent? How do we get into a place where we basically use technology to be able to help us as far as healthcare is concerned? There has to be, first of all, a bridge that literally brings Africa together in terms of our own digital divide. We are completely not united even on the digital front. If you get into most of our rural areas, you'll realize that internet connectivity is not readily available. We are even talking about power long before we even start talking about internet connectivity. We have very low penetration rate so far as the continent is concerned, either for power or for our digital footprint. We need to be able to make sure that we have internet access in local areas. That would be a very good way to start, and then to make sure that the internet connectivity is first, it's affordable, not something that you have to pay an arm to a leg, just because you're trying to be online. And then we also have to find ways in which we promote some kind of digital literacy, where we get young people and older people as well to be more involved in technology, more involved in the digital age, and then making sure that we get the continent to align itself properly to what is Afrocentric and what is it that what is it that our society will want to be able to promote. For example, there is an app called TikTok. If you were in China, the app TikTok, it's not the same thing that is in Africa. It's not the same thing that is in the United States of America. In China, I think it's somewhere around 8 p.m. in the evening. No child is permitted to use that app. The app automatically just locks you out, I think by 8 p.m. or something. And then it is a certain amount of hours that you can use the app per day. This app is literally been designed and developed by China, and what is good for those Chinese kids is not good for the rest of the world. So you have our own children being exposed to all kinds of garbage, pure garbage, on the African continent and in the West, so far as the app is concerned. Meanwhile, China is just literally making tremendous amount of money on this app, and yet destroying our own children in the process. Now, you may want to blame China, but the reality is you have to start talking deeply about us as a country. How come, or as a continent in this case, how come most of our leaders have no idea as to how we can be able to manage this, how we can be able to control this, to make sure that the information that our children, they are basically harvesting online, those informations are good for them, it's good for our culture, it's good to promote who we are as a people. The TikTok, the Chinese version of the TikTok, promotes more of a national idea. The Chinese version of TikTok basically pushes young Chinese to work harder. All right, it pushes them to dream harder, to be more nationalistic, to push the ideas and the agenda of the Chinese people. It is more culturally inclined to promote things that are culturally valuable to the Chinese man. Unfortunately, on the African continent, what we have so far as this media platform is concerned is nothing else but garbage, pure junk. Certified junk, I mean like classical junk. That's what we are feeding our children, that's what we are consuming ourselves, and in the end we have no one else to blame but the few Neanderthals that we have that are running our countries in the name of presidents and God knows what in between. I think that we really have to be able to embrace this change and find ways in which we can be able to harness what is it that technology has to offer in the area of health. There are many people who are dying on the African continent because they do not just have the simple ability to be able to do something called an annual physical, or maybe a physical that takes place 2 or 3 years, like in the case of colon cancer. You have somebody who is diagnosed with colon cancer, maybe stage 4, end stage, and you're asking yourself, how did this happen? Well, the colon cancer started in their system, which could have been detected maybe 20 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. But when the African finally gets to discover that they have colon cancer, it is almost at the end stage. In America, there's something called a colonoscopy, and most developed nations, there's something called a colonoscopy, where you go to the hospital, they'll insert something into your rectum, they'll look at the walls of your colon to see, if there's something, a mole, a polyp growing up or something, and then they'll probably cut the polyp, test it in the laboratory to see if that polyp can become cancerous. Based upon that, recommendations are made, and then because that is the polyp that grows up to create cancer, so that different things can now begin to happen in terms of your nutrition, and in terms of testing, so you don't get into a place where we are treating you for cancer. You get to a place where we are preventing you from getting cancer. A few of our elites on the continent of Africa has the capacity to travel out of the country, but the local man and the average person who is still on the continent do not have access to this kind of healthcare. So how come we still have people who are in power, who are thinking more about themselves? They travel out of the countries, meanwhile, their own uncles, their brothers, their sisters are dying from the same disease, which is quite preventable. But unfortunately, because we do not have the healthcare system, we are not pushing for technology, we are not investing in this space, we still have a lot of people dying. In Africa, we will invest millions and billions of US dollars, all right, in trying to build up soccer stadiums, that we invest billions of US dollars in building repurposed hospitals, reference hospitals, and with better technology, and that can be able to help sustain the life of our people. Well, somebody will say, if we can't eat, talk less about us trying to take care of ourselves so far as healthcare is concerned. But I think that this is the bridge. technology, and healthcare. This is the future. We have to be able to find ways in which we live longer and live healthier. And the only way for us to achieve this is to be able to use technology in the space of healthcare. There are better AI models, artificial intelligence models right now that has the capacity to be able to do a better, to look into maybe a medical report, to look maybe into an X-ray, into an ecography, and be able to do better prediction, better understanding that most medical doctors can, because the AI model has gone through thousands of different X-rays, thousands of different ecography reports, and they are now being trained, and with their AI skills has the unique ability to be able to do better understanding and then better recommendations so far as the healthcare treatment is concerned. We need this on the African continent. Imagine a case where you have somebody with multiple issues in their body, but yet with this particular AI system, they do have the capacity to be able to take one person's report based upon a series of other metrics, parameters that has been defined within the system concerning that particular individual, mirror match that with thousands of different reports, and what we have will be a masterpiece so far as your own personalized healthcare is concerned. Maybe a healthcare system where we collect your DNA, and based upon your DNA, we are able to understand, based upon thousands of all the DNAs, in the sample size, and we are able to predict exactly what you need to watch out for and how you need, and this goes as far back as your nutrition. What I'm saying is this: preventive care, preventive healthcare, it's healthcare. That is the best form of healthcare. Let's prevent and stop you from getting a particular disease. Let us not treat you from that disease. It is better if we prevent you from getting the disease, and this comes if we fully understand and implement solutions in artificial intelligence and solutions that comes as a result of just outright testing long before anything happens. I think this is where we go. If we're able to harness these two, I think Africa will be in a better place.
Africa will be in a better place indeed. Staying with you, Dr. FONGOD, you earlier on mentioned that it's imperative for Africa to be able to use technology in trying to prevent some healthcare issues on the continent of Africa, and you went ahead in citing very practical examples. And now, given this innovation which you've brought to the table, how imperative or how important is it for Africans to collaborate amongst themselves so as to better make use of some of these innovations or some of these evolutions that are coming on, even welcoming or coming into the African continent, so as to better address issues like this? Because as we speak, many African countries are still dealing with mpox. So how can Africa use collaboration as a tool to address some of these healthcare problems?
Well, one of the beautiful thing about the world today is that we live in a digital time where information is just readily available for anyone, and by ourselves we are also pushing as much as we can to let people know exactly what we're doing on social media. People are reporting themselves every single day. Do you know the one particular place in the world that is a destination for healthcare for the regular African, not just regular African, the African who at least has a little bit of money? The country is called India. And the reason why it's easy to go to India is because the Indians have understood that they have become a touristic destination for healthcare. So if anybody is sick anywhere on the continent of Africa, they go to India. Now, here's the thing. As good as India is, there are still countries on the African continent with those kinds of technology that Africans need to be able to tie into. If you will not be able to open up the African continent for Africans to travel without being hindered one way or the other, at least allow this particular provision in terms of healthcare. If we can just be able to allow those who are traveling for healthcare purposes to travel free on the continent of Africa, I think that we will have started improving and increasing the capacities that we have on the continent of Africa so far as our healthcare system is concerned. Number one. Number two, there has to be a collaboration between African countries when it comes to us understanding whatever infectious disease is rolling in one part of the continent of Africa to another. We are Africans, most likely our genetic markers are the same across the board, which means that if there's something that is happening to an African somewhere in the western part of the continent of Africa, it should be happening to that same same person in the southern part of Africa or in the eastern part of the continent. We have to be able to understand and share these information together, because this is the way we beat any kind of infectious disease that will be coming up or anyone that seems to emerge. Secondly, we also have to make sure that we lock up our borders and prevent the West from experimenting on the continent of Africa. I don't care what name they call it. We have seen the tremendous evil that has happened on the continent of Africa in places like Kenya, in places like Uganda, in places like Cameroon, where foreign companies, some with reputable organizations like the Bill Gates Foundation that was recently sued not long ago, as a result of coming in with vaccines that says it does one thing, but the underlying factor is that it does something else. We saw this in places like Cameroon with another company, and so we have to be able to make sure that we lock our borders when it comes to all of these, draconian testing that is taking place on the African continent with pharmaceutical companies, around the world. That actually has to stop. We just have to speak up and make sure that this stuff does not persist so far as the African is concerned. But I think if we are able to collaborate on the continent of Africa, share resources, because some countries have resources, some others do not, but also invest a lot in healthcare. I think that one of the Human Development Index is how good the people feel, and one of the parameters in the Human Development Index is actually longevity. So how long people live. I think that we have to be able to make sure that people are feeling good, and secondly, people are living longer. A healthy lifespan is good, and if we can be able to make sure that we have societies and communities on the African continent where people are not growing old and getting sick and dying, or people are dying early, I think we will basically improve the productivity of our societies if people live longer. And this will come if only we collaborate across the board. If a particular country is known for a particular type of surgery, if a particular country is known for cancer treatment, if a particular country is known for something else, that country should be open to all Africans to go into that particular area, either for training, so that we can be able to harness and understand how healthcare is being practiced in that particular hospital, in that particular country, and then import that and bring it back into our own individual home countries, and then the overall health of the continent will improve. Those are the ways I look at it, and I think that we cannot not do that.
Exactly, and of course we could borrow an example like what happened in Rwanda with the eradication of the Marburg virus disease in that part of the African continent. Now, moving forward, and I'd like to get the opinion now for Harrison. Now, Harrison, looking at the African continent amidst the numerous challenges plaguing Africa, how can Africa advocate for the inclusion of the continent at the global level, so some of its vital priorities can actually be met?
Yes, really, this has been a conversation that has been had for a very long time, where Africa has been fighting to be equal at the table, and sometimes it has been understood as if Africa is playing victim. But still, Africa continues to be underprivileged because of some of the decisions that are made globally. For example, like the organizations that we have mentioned that are part of the G20, the World Bank, the IMF, the kind of debt situation that we are in Africa. For example, you find a country has about 12 trillion in debt. That's a country whose systems cannot effectively run. Because when you are in debt, it means that you collect taxes to pay debt. Where's development? It means that you have to borrow more in order to develop. So I think the business of loans in Africa has been really lucrative for some organizations. And what I'm looking at it to be is, for example, this opportunity that President Cyril has if an agreement can be reached that interest rates for the loans that Africa is taking are reduced to be favorable, because it doesn't make sense when you put America and, for example, Kenya in the same bracket. Those are two countries that are not at the same level. So it's important, as first of all, to put Africa forward as a continent that needs fairness in terms of the debts that we are getting. And considering that most of the challenges that we are solving with the debt are also contributed by our oppressors. So that, and again, I really don't know how this exactly can be achieved in the context of this discussion. But we have a challenge as Africans. We also need to put ourselves forward as people who can manage their affairs and instill confidence, claim our position with merit that really Africa has done for itself 1, 2, 3. Because it is very disappointing when you see countries in huge debt, but politicians are still stealing money and stashing them in offshore accounts. Sometimes even these countries wonder what kind of Africans we are when we steal from our country and we go to stash money abroad. I think one of the reasons why we will be respected as Africans is when we will show our genuine commitment towards our own affairs, such that we can be seen that we are pursuing the best for our people relentlessly. I think that will give us a lot of position in Africa. The challenges that Africa faces also in terms of security, as my co-panelist mentioned. I mentioned something earlier, I think another discussion, that Africa needs to understand that we are like a tree that has fruits. And every person who passes by would like, I saw a mountain that was sliding in DRC, and it said that the mountain was leaving very huge copper deposits. You can imagine the kind of interest that it's going to bring. Copper is a very widely sought for mineral. So we have ended up with huge conflicts in Africa because of scramble for resources and scramble for power and governance systems and the control of how our governments are done. And I believe that we can reach a point where Africa is left to determine their future for themselves. Because when we have powers that be meddling into local affairs of African countries, then that makes Africa not able to run their own affairs. But that notwithstanding, we need to claim our position and be people who are genuinely standing for what is good for our people. So I think this is a great opportunity, and let us see what South Africa will do with this position. Let us genuinely see, because I also understand politically, South Africa is also aligned to BRICS and many other political controversies that are in there. But let us give South Africa and the chance and support that they need to see if we can really realize change from this position that they have gotten. Because really, we shouldn't, for example, like my co-panelist was saying, sometimes you'll see foreign companies, foreign individuals coming to Kenya to film films that are dehumanizing. I saw another clip of certain Chinese who had recorded videos of things, Zambian children, and the Zambian children were insulting themselves. And the video is spread on social media platforms in China. And part of the reasons why our fellow Africans are vulnerable is because they are not stable financially. A foreigner comes, they want to do their tests, they want to do their research, you're being used as a specimen, and you're being given just a little money. People will go for it. That is why you've seen sometimes Africans, many of them are struggling, are tumbling on each other to go to work in foreign countries as casual laborers, where we have gotten most cases of fellow Africans being treated unfairly and even being harmed. So the position of Africa needs to be established. But let us not only rely on being given this recognition. We have to take it. We have to show that Africa is ready for this. So I believe this is a chance for one of Africans and African country to show what is it that Africans can stand for, given a chance. Yeah, it is going to be a fight. It's going to be a fight to realize the actual position for Africa, but life is a struggle. We have to continue struggling and ensure that what we deserve is given to us, that we explore our potential to the fullest and live satisfactory and successful livelihoods. Because many of our Africans don't live fulfilling lives because they are marred by diseases, poverty. We need to end that. And the only way to end that is if we truly believe in ourselves and showcase ourselves as people who can manage their own affairs, who need genuine support, who can give returns on investment, and who are willing to work. One of the reasons why things like the regulations on social media use are working in China could be because people are very busy. Yeah, you see sometimes even political rallies in many developed countries are not full. In Africa, when a politician is in a rally, the rally is full. There is even a stampede. Yeah, you will, for example, you know, if such kind of regulations could be input into Africa, you would hear people championing for their rights. They want social media to be open 24/7. Why? It's also because of of how our culture has mutated into people who are not very much occupied with too much work. So I think we also need, and that will come with continued change making, continued programs, continued support, continued deliberate intention by our leaders to show that people need to get busy, people need to work, people deserve support, people deserve a rightful position to gain what they deserve. Because things like fighting, sometimes people who are fighting in DRC are fellow DRC people. You wonder, what kind of situation are we in? Why are we fighting each other? Why are we fighting our brothers and sisters? We shouldn't do that, because that is divide and conquer. People will be out there. People split Sudan. Sudan is not supposed to be fighting. People split it because they want to do some things in the midst of the chaos. So those are some of the things that I believe need to be done to ensure that Africa realizes a rightful position. Because there are individual Africans, individuals who are respected worldwide, yeah? Because they are Africans who have shown that they are intellectual, they have capacity, and they can deliver equally like any other person from across the world. Regardless of the color of their skin, you have the capacity to do what you deserve to. So I think that is where we need to be. We should do a lot, and I believe the much we do, the much results, positive results we'll get. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you to Harrison, now who's joined us all the way from Kenya. Now, we're gradually coming to the end of today's edition of Talking Point of our Pan-African channel, ladies and gentlemen. And that leads me to the last question with you, Dr. Stanley FONGOD. Now, Your co-panelist Harrison was stating that Africa should believe in itself while striving to tackle some of the challenges plaguing the continent. And of course, I believe it's in line with what you earlier on stated. Now, given you're one of those that champion for the fact that there are supposed to be African solutions to African problems. With that said, how do you believe, or how do you think Africa can maximize its potential for the development of the African continent, while of course charting the way forward, as of course we are expecting South Africa to take the baton of command ahead of the next tenure, which is 2025, within the G20 bloc. So, charting the way forward, how can Africa maximize its own potential, given South Africa says it wants to defend the interests of Africa, to champion and of course resolve some of the African problems which are within the continent of Africa, which you say need African solutions?
I will start by saying that the future looks bright. And the reason why I'm quite optimistic has nothing to do with South Africa's, being at the helm of the G20. That's not it at all. I think the future looks bright. As much as we keep talking about what needs to be done on the African continent by Africans, then the future looks bright. The future looks bright when young people on the African continent become, get into the e-commerce space, digital entrepreneurship, creating e-commerce platforms, setting up incubators and hubs. Once we have young Africans harnessing these spaces, then the future looks bright. Once we have young Africans who fully understand that the agricultural space needs them, and that there is something to be said about somebody who is a farmer, and that being a farmer is not something that is left in the margins and in the fringes of those in society, but that being a farmer is quite honorable, then the future looks bright. And I think that the future looks bright when young Africans fully understand their place so far as governance is concerned, that they have to do whatever it takes to take their position and discuss issues that pertains to the future. I think then the future looks bright. I'm quite optimistic about what is possible, and then whatever South Africa decides to do so far as the G20 summit is concerned, harnessing and bringing capital to the continent of Africa so that we can invest in infrastructure, finding ways in which we can leverage the mining sector so that we can be able to get money to put into the infrastructural development that we need on the African continent, putting a lot of money in spaces like energy, bringing money in the mining sector, finding ways in which we can interconnect the whole entire continent, and in doing what is needful so far as our development is concerned, then I think that the future looks bright. I'm quite optimistic about the future, and I think that I've just basically drank the whole entire Kool-Aid about the future looks bright. And for me, rather than trying to look at the continent the way it is, I look at the continent the way it should be, and that is the way I think about the continent going forward. Kudos to the President of South Africa in the new role. I wish him well, but I hope that he operates within the framework that Africa needs to be promoted first, and African ideas needs to be promoted first, and that whatever is coming from the West that is not in line with our cultures, values, norms, and traditions is something else that we absolutely do not respect, and we will basically spit in his face if that was going to be the case. We don't want any of those matters on the continent of Africa. For the development of the continent of Africa does not mean we as Africans need to lose our soul. We are Africans. We will always be African. Long after the European nations would have rise and fall, long after Western imperialistic structures would have rise and fallen, Africa will remain Africa, and we must be able to maintain our dignity right up to the very end. And I think that, for me, it's what makes us unique. And therefore, I'm quite optimistic, and the future looks bright.
Thank you so much, Dr. FONGOD. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Dr. FONGOD, Pan-Africanist economist, and of course the CEO of Crossland FinTech. Meanwhile, I'll call say thank you to you, BONIFACE Harrison, Executive Director at MUEMACTION Post, who joined us all the way from Kenya. It was a pleasure to have you on board.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's on that note that we shall be drawing down the curtains of today's edition of Talking Point over your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Now, it's on that note that we will be parting ways, but then I wouldn't go without leaving you in the company of our programs. So, ladies and gentlemen, do continue to enjoy the programs over your Pan-African channel. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.